So my name is Madison Margolin. I am one of the founders of this summit. I'm also a journalist. I've been covering the overlap between Judaism, psychedelics, and cannabis for the past 7 years. And specifically, I co-founded the psychedelic magazine Double Blind. Um, so before I get started specifically on this conference, I just also want to take a moment to really acknowledge what is going on in India right now, specifically with COVID. And if you want to give back, there's an organization that, or a site that Bluth recommended to me, giveindia.org. All right, so going forward, so what is this phenomenon of Jews in India? I grew up sort of in the Ram Dass community, and a lot of my parents' friends, including Parvati, who's right here, were a bunch of Jewish people, quote unquote HinJews, who had Jewish last names, Jewish first names that they usually didn't use, or English first names that they usually didn't use. And I grew up with kirtan or Hindu chanting events, and at the same time, I had a bat mitzvah, and my dad sent us to Hebrew school, and so there was kind of this really interesting melange of cultures going on in the household. And so essentially, I think there's a lot behind the Jews in India phenomenon. A lot of people, specifically in the post-Holocaust period, and the counterculture, were looking for spirituality and maybe not finding it specifically in Judaism. And so they were seeking it out in India, in Buddhism and Hinduism. And then today as well, a lot of Israelis specifically go to India after the army. And that's called the quote unquote Hummus Trail, in places like Goa, I think Varanasi also. Igal, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but lots of Israelis in Varanasi up in the north. And so I'm going to, we're going to explore what are the various things that are leading Jewish people and Israelis to India. So before I get started, I'm just going to introduce everybody. Again, there's Parvati, who's a longtime family friend of ours. She's been midwifing spiritually oriented nonfiction books and memoirs as a developmental editor and writer since her first efforts with Ram Dass's classic Be Here Now. The author of Love Everyone, her next book, Whispers in the Heart, will be published in 2022. She also works with spiritual organizations, past and present, of the board of the Hanuman Temple in Taos, New Mexico, and events like Global Peace Initiative of Women Conferences. She's also on the advisory board of the Love Serve Remember Foundation. Next, we have Professor Alan Brill. He's a Cooperman Ross Endowed Chair at the Seton Hall University. Dr. Brill is also the author of Judaism and World Religions, Christianity, Islam, and Eastern Religions, Judaism and Other Religions, Models of Understanding, and Thinking God, the Mysticism of Rabbi, I'm going to mispronounce this, Zadok of Lublin.
But more importantly, I just a new book on Rabbi on the Ganges, Judaism and Hinduism.
You just finished your bio for me. Thank you. And he also has a blog, kavana.blog. So you should go ahead and read it. And you also were a Fulbright Senior Scholar Award for Research and Teaching at Benares Hindu University in Varanasi. Next, we have Rodger Kamenetz, whose 8 books of poetry include The Missing Jew, The Lowercase Jew Yonder, and Dream Logic. He wrote the perennial bestseller, The Jew and the Lotus, which opened up with the subject of Jewish-Buddhist dialogue and became a PBS documentary. In 2007, Harper published The History of Last Night's Dream, and he was featured on Oprah Winfrey's Soul series. He is Professor Emeritus of English and Religious Studies and held the Sternberg Honors Chair at LSU. He's also the founder of Natural Dream Work and leads 18 colleagues in a unique approach to working with dreams for spiritual direction. Next, we have Rachel Rosenbluth, also known as Rabbi Bluth, who's the Chief Creative Officer for Living Jewishly. Ordained from Beit Midrash Harel, she then backpacked globally, connecting with devotional communities and getting her yoga teacher's certification from Sivananda Vedanta Ashram in India. Bluth was elected to Religions for Peace, a multi-religious global network. She graduated from McGill in Buddhism and International Development, and she directed Achvat and Amin Rouhani, an Israeli-Palestinian Peace and Justice Initiative, and was trained by IPCRI, an Israeli-Palestinian cooperation in Israeli-Palestinian cooperation entrepreneurship. She's an artist and founded Tel Aviv Seaside Shabbos and leads global Jewish retreats. And drawing from ancient wisdom and grounding spirituality and peace and justice work, Bluth hopes to create a better world for all. Last but not least, we have Igal Tartakovsky. He's a mindfulness-based psychotherapist in ACT and Satya who specializes in psychedelic integration. Igal is co-founder of Safe Shore Psychedelic Care, a psychedelic harm reduction organization that creates safe spaces in festivals and gives workshops around the world. He's also the founder of Soft Landing, a project that supports young people on their return to Israel from their post-army journey abroad, which is mostly to India. So thank you everybody for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you. And again, like I said, this panel is really, the topic of this panel is really close to my heart. So just let's start with a basic question. Everyone kind of just take 2 minutes for this. And Bluth, I know you want to take a little bit longer. What are Jews seeking in the East? And is that related to their psychedelic experiences? So whoever wants to start. Parvati.
I'll start. I went to India probably earlier than any of you did, which was, I arrived in India in 1971, and I was there for a year, left in March of 72. And basically, I mean, I grew up in the Mad Men culture of the 50s and early 60s, and we knew it wasn't reality. I mean, we just knew it. There had to be more to life than what we saw going on. And then the counterculture started heating up. And I read Timothy Leary's book called High Priest. And it was the first time I'd ever seen the words cosmic consciousness. And it was like, I finally got it. I said, oh, that's what I'm looking for. Okay, where do I get that? So the next thing that happened was Orange Sunshine, which was Osley's famous little orange LSD pill. And having read about cosmic consciousness, I mean, that's where I went. I went right into oneness with my first acid trip. And as I was coming down from that, somebody handed me the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And the next day I was going, yeah, that's what, yeah. You know, it was like, they got it. They knew what I had experienced. They knew, you know, this wisdom existed, and it existed in the East. And more of the East was coming in to America. Ravi Shankar was playing down the road from us at Woodstock, you know. Eastern thought was starting to come in. I mean, there were a few books we could get, like Autobiography of a Yogi. You know, there are a couple of things that were there. Hermann Hesse's novels, things that were pulling us to the journey to the East. And then, of course, 3 weeks after I took my first acid trip, I met Ram Dass. And when I met him, I had met a guy at a party who said, hey, want to go meet a saint? And 3 weeks before, I would have said, no, they don't exist. But now it was like, okay. And when I met Ram Dass, all I could see was light coming from him. And 2 days later, I moved in, and my whole life went in a whole new direction. And within a year and a half, I was in India, because whatever Ram Dass had gotten from this old man in a blanket was what we wanted. We wanted to go to the source of wherever he got what he got. And we did, and wound up with somebody who was really an embodiment of that cosmic consciousness I was seeking. So, I mean, the only thing I knew about, I had a very lacking Jewish education. I mean, my father wasn't bar mitzvah, my brother wasn't bar mitzvah. I really had absolutely no training. And all I had ever known about Kabbalah was that you had to be 40 years old and male. And I said, well, that's a dead end. That's not happening. So India was it. India was the promise of actually experiencing something personally rather than reading about it. It was, we sought the experience of like a living tradition, and we found it.
Thank you, Parvati. One thing, when my dad met Maharaji, he was a little bit weirded out by all these Jewish people sort of kissing someone's toes. But then he said that Maharaji, who's Ram Dass's guru, or everyone's guru here, like felt like a Jewish Zaidi, like a very grandfatherly character. And so then my dad was somehow okay with that after that. Who wants to go next? Alan, you see me like you're unmuted. Yes.
Okay, so I agree. I mean, I'm going to continue where Parvati started. You know, people took LSD, it was the counterculture. People had a sense of mystical oneness, dream work, and all that. And yes, to reiterate, people turn to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they turn to Hindu, Buddhist, serpent power, I Ching, all sorts of things turn to. But I'm going to give you a contrasting story. My doctoral advisor, Ewart Cousins, was one of those who participated in the 1962 Good Friday experiment with LSD, but as a Catholic priest. But as a Catholic priest, he knew he could then go to Catholic monasteries, learn the mystical tradition, and then he wound up producing the classics of Western spirituality and world spirituality volumes. Jews had no place to turn. Jews really bought into the idea that the West is rational, madmen. The synagogues were devoid of any mysticism. It's not like you could find, for Catholics, still had retreat centers. And therefore they went east. It was the only place you were going to find anything corresponding to the psychedelic mysticism. And by that point, India already had this huge reputation because already Allen Ginsberg had gone a decade before and actually learned Hindi and brought lots of things that were out there, that India was the place where the Rig Veda spoke about soma and drugs already. It was a place about individual enlightenment. Something that'll probably come up later in the thing is that you weren't talking about Jewish peoplehood or anything about anti-Semitism. It was a place that you went to deal with spirituality, and India had that reputation. And for Jews, for most Jews, unless you were one of those early figures who got involved in some form of Jewish mysticism, India was the only place to go to.
Oh, thank you. Rodger, Igal, which one of you wants to go sec? Maybe Rodger? You're muted. You're still muted.
I know.
Yeah, there you go. Nope, muted again.
Too many buttons. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to be with this group and talk about whatever we're going to talk about. I've been to India 3 or 4 times, and I think the last time, because of this wonderful artist and visionary Azrael Cohen, he passed away, and he brought Mimi Feigelson was on that trip too, and we did a Passover Seder in Dharamsala with Israelis and Hindus and Tibetans, and we did it in Hebrew, English, Hindi, and Tibetan, so it lasted like 18 hours or something. It was really insane. But I remember that many of the street signs in Dharamsala at that time were in Hebrew, that Dharamsala, especially during the times of the Dalai Lama's teachings, were full of Israelis on this Hummus Trail. Some came for spiritual enlightenment, some came for hashish. I mean, let's face it, let's be real about all this. This whole thing is, some people wanted to have mystical experiences, some people just wanted to have fun and get high, and that's always been the case with this. I think we should be real about that. I was one of those, so that's why I'm mentioning that. And my sense of unity and oneness certainly came. I was a teenager in college when I started experimenting, and I do remember I had a really good friend who took LSD and called me up and said, "All is one." And I said, "One for all, 3 musketeers." And and then a couple months later, I took mine and I called him back and said, "You're right, all is one." So it was like that unitive experience, I think, that seeks a language, a particular language. And certainly India, the whole, not just the religion, but really the people and the way they are, the immensity of India, the complexity of India, and really the beauty of India was so impressive to me. I feel that really this unitive experience, however we get there, it's not only through a substance, challenges the particularism, especially of our Jewish tradition, and also asks us to look in our tradition for what ways to connect the particulars to the universal. And that's a big task for us and has been for my generation and for the next generation. So I'll just stop with that.
And Igal?
Hi, so I guess, first of all, I'm really happy to be part of this panel. So thanks for inviting me. And I guess I'm here to represent the Israeli angle. So I have to say, I think might be a slightly different angle because what fascinates and what draws most people to India, the first time at least, because there's many Israelis that go back and forth for years, is breaking free from a very constraining system, which all countries have, but we also have a 3-year military service after high school. And I think many people have this really strong urge to go and break free. So India, a lot of people aren't necessarily attracted, or some people even go in spite of the fact that India is spiritual. They just go because it's cheap, it's exotic, it's affordable. You can. Many people go there. It's kind of it has become like an integral part of the system of like high school, army, India, then you start school. So so that's why many people go, and this is where, and some people come for spirituality, but a lot of people go for getting high, as Rodger said. And people come for that reason, but many people from that experience, from being in India, firstly asking themselves every morning, what do I want to do today? Which is something they might have not asked themselves for years before that. And then through having kind of a serendipitous spiritual experiences, because India is so full of it. And a lot of people get exposed to psychedelics the first time. First of all, you get released from the army, you start smoking a lot. It's part of, breaking free. It's kind of a big FU to the system. And then people discover psychedelics, and sometimes also as a getting high method, but then suddenly stumble upon spirituality and starting to connect to India, and also back to Judaism. Maybe I'll speak more of this later, but this is kind of the Israeli trail.
And then Bluth.
Hello, it's really nice to be here. And, I don't know that I've ever been on a Zoom room with a bunch of Jewish people where I feel like I can say, with a full heart, Om Namah Shivaya. So thanks for having me, and for everyone who's joined this. And when you first asked this question of like Jews and why India and what's the attraction to Eastern traditions and Eastern wisdom and philosophy, the thing that comes to my mind to answer is the classic line from Asia Pacific, which is same but different. And to kind of delve in here, I want to use a little bit of my own story. And Parvati, you said you were probably in this group, the first person to be in India, and I would say I'm most likely the most recent. I was to be in India. I was just in India as COVID hit. So, my path has been a dance from my Jewish upbringing to an undergrad in Buddhism, to learning Hasidus, Halacha, and eventually to Smicha, rabbinic ordination in Jerusalem, and then to India. And as my friend Ganga Devi would say, who's in the crowd today, it's been omnidirectional and very interdevotional. So my first inspiration came in my undergrad degree through the philosophical study of Mahayana Buddhism. And this was my first sort of invitation to explore conversations on the nature of reality, the underlying unity in all, expanded consciousness. And I like to say that in some ways, my first like real rabbi was Rav Buddha. And Rav Buddha opened my heart and mind to what is possible, and maybe to say it better, like to what is. And this mystical way of thinking was not part of the Judaism that I grew up with, although clearly it is a part of Judaism, and it totally blew my mind open. And from that, I began a quest to bridge the mystical with practice. I wanted to know, how do I live these ideas in my life, in my relationships, in my everyday, and to really forge a life connected to consciousness in a way that was culturally relevant and made sense with my world, with my rituals, with my community. I grew up in such a Jewish world, Jewish summer camp, Jewish education, Shabbos dinners, and such a care for Jewish community. And so I wanted to figure out, like, how do I bring these things together? And so, Rav Buddha in many ways like invited me to dive into Hasidus. And thanks to a whole bunch of people who are actually part of the Psychedelics conference, you know, many teachers and many authors. This opened me to the Jewish mystical teachings that were sort of similar to what I was inspired by in Buddhism, and sort of in a language that that was more my own. And this is teachings of, you know, the infinite, of all pervading holiness, and, you know, a taste of ecstatic, joyous prayer and nigunim and so on. And anyways, from there, I ended up spending a bunch of years in Jerusalem learning halacha and Gemara, trying to figure out how our practice and ritual and legal structures can actually connect us to something deeper. And on a side note, you know, what that means for me as a woman. And I spent many years sort of hunched over books in a basement in Jerusalem, studying for smicha at Beit Midrash Harel, and really trying to understand the tools and teachings of our tradition in a framework that many women haven't had access to. And I'll say two things. One, this was a huge zchut. It was a total treat. And by the end of my rabbinic education, I was like completely burnt out and exhausted and disconnected and dried up. So the sort of paradox of the yeshiva world. So the first thing I did as a rabbi and fresh out of yeshiva was set off for India to really heal my relationship with God and with spirit and with my own heart. And I kind of returned to this Eastern tradition which had inspired me in the first place. And it was in this, like India, it's like this adorned chaos. And it was there that I found temples as often as I find coffee shops in Tel Aviv. And it was in India that I really, filled my cup up again. I sat in temples blown away by the rawness of the devotion, the accessibility of the mystical. And in one of the first temples I went into, I found myself weeping, like bawling my eyes out for the temple life that Judaism once had and that had been destroyed. And after so many years in a basement, kind of crouched over Jewish texts, I welcomed my barefoot body into my spiritual practice. I deepened in meditation. I learned Vedanta and connected with, similar theologies to what I was finding in Hasidut, which I hope Professor Brill will sort of bring us into those parallels a little more in this talk. And I began practicing yoga, bringing my body into the practice for the first time in my life. And that journey, I ended up with a bunch of Sufi pilgrims in ecstatic devotion to Allah, but that would be for another panel. But all in all, like India is this diverse place of inspiration. And I think for many people, it's a place of new pathways of thinking and being. Just the sensory experience there, it kind of feels like Purim all the time. I mean, it's that place of sort of new pathways and surprise that we find in inspiration. And so, as COVID hit, I got the last flight out of India, and I've continuously sort of working to bring some of that inspiration and some of that aesthetic into my Jewish life, and to sort of just reinvigorate and re-inspire many things which of course exist in Judaism, but for me needed a bit of I don't know, like a dose of inspiration, let's say, like an amplification. And I think that for me, the question of Jews in India, and I know I'm coming from a particularly sort of theological lens here, is the question of religion in general. It's a question of seeking. And Art Green, Rabbi Art Green, who was one of my first teachers, he put it so beautifully, and this is to paraphrase slightly. He said, religion is about tools for cultivating an interiority, a life of spirit, an inward journey that leads one towards self-transcendence, to an awareness of the universal self in whose presence we exist. Ritual and practice is there to awaken this feeling of expansion and belonging. Judaism and all religions exist to help us discover and cultivate that divine spark, and then build a society and civilization that uplifts and upholds the dignity and holiness in all human beings and in all of humanity. And so just to sort of summarize these thoughts, I think that, each religion is a different path towards the same place. and not just religion, you know, the psychedelic path and the quantum physics path and the philosophical path. And within each religion, there are all these different ways. You know, within Judaism, you can find paths of contemplation, of intellectualism, of philosophy, of embodiment, of devotion. You know, all traditions have these different components, but they're not always abundantly accessible. And I think for us, you know, in Judaism in particular, I think part of that is due to the trauma and oppression. You know, books and temples have been burnt and new paths have been forged. So I think the question that I have for anyone listening here is really like, where do you find your inspiration? You know, what is the spark for you, that feeling of connection, of love, of imagination? And, you know, to me, I would say that inspiration is what people are seeking. And that inspiration is a thing to like cherish and honor and bring it into practice and root in the wisdom, tradition, and culture that you inherited from your ancestors or that you've chosen to commit to. You know, bring it into a life of practice, because this is like this particular and universal dance. And I would say this is also a beautiful opportunity in living in such a diverse and open world.
Thank you. A few people are asking if you could put that Art Green quote in the chat. So that was such a beautiful quote.
Yeah, I'll put it's a paraphrase. So this is a blend. It's from Art Green's new book. It can be found in its like original in the introduction, Judaism for the World, I think it's called. But I will paste my paraphrase.
Cool. Yeah, well, a lot of the things that you said resonated with me. You know, when I was in India last in Goa, I made friends with a local there, and he said India is the richest country in the world. And he says it's not that the people there are also rich, but it's so rich in color and flavor and spirit and like it's sort of like life on steroids. Everything in India is so much more intense and experiential sometimes. So it's just like a trip in and of itself being there. So I'm gonna I want to backtrack a little bit, and this is directed toward Alan. What do you see as the parallels between Judaism and Eastern traditions? And, you know, is it kosher? Or, you know, is Hinduism sort of avodah zarah? Like how can, as Jews, we sort of study this?
So thank you. So I got the privilege of actually, you know, living in Benares Hindu University in Varanasi. I got to travel around India. You know, I would let tuk-tuk drivers take me to where they worshiped. I lived with them, with the Brahmins on campus. And it was amazing teaching a classroom of Hindu and Buddhist monks or aspiring teachers, aspiring pandits about Judaism. And I taught them Kabbalah and Hasidut. And I got an immediate feedback in terms of where the parallels were. I mean, it's not like something I got to sit back and reflect. I mean, they told me on the spot. And it's really funny, like what they picked up on immediately. I showed them Genesis and they immediately said, oh, Adam was a vegetarian. Like they went like immediately into that. But for example, I did Hasidut with them and they all said, oh, no, that's too bhakti. We're already more Yana. We're in the university. We prefer Kabbalah to Hasidut. Meaning there was an immediate reaction because for them, studying Hindu and Buddhist meditation texts all day, you know, I was the novelty. To do a piece of Zohar or Israel Garona or Maggid of Mesrich was the novelty. So, I mean, I learned immediately that one, you know, there's a great deal of wisdom there that we can learn from in terms of meditation, in terms of theories of oneness, or even theology. Some people want to talk about oneness within Hasidut, and they become rather tongue-tied. What does that mean? And India opens up this huge, rich wisdom to talk about these topics. But at the same time, you know, same, but different, you realize that we're quite similar, much to learn, but then to understand where we are also different. I learned much more about how with the Jewish tradition that was very much centered on mitzvot and having an intention, a kavanah, was very similar to tantric traditions, because that's all tantra technically means a weave. that you're connecting a mental state with an action. And, the clear scripted versions, our Jewish books of the dead have never even been translated yet. Nobody even thinks of those in those visions. And I learned actually from the inside how much similar, how much wisdom, and in some way, reading their material lets you go back to Judaism and see what's really needs to be done. On one level, what I learned the most and changed my way of reading is the role on vision, darshan. And now you go back and see the vision within Bible and rabbinic texts about the importance of sight, which forgetting anything else that we've kind of written out. But to put the most important point, Swami Vivekananda came to the World Parliament of Religions more than 100 years ago and taught a simplified path of Hindu meditation, because you go back to his sources in the Kurma Purana and they're very complex. But he created a simple meditation which became the model for all future meditation approaches, TM and everything else. Someone like Aryeh Kaplan, if he had lived in 1900 and put out that book and had a bunch of students who would create simplified four-sentence versions of Abulafia or three-sentence versions of Rav Israel, we would have had a very different Jewish history. Hinduism is very much, for many Hindus, is ritual-centered, but it was a clear choice to become modern by putting their meditation foot first. We didn't do that, but there's no reason we can't do that. I mean, I was at a great session yesterday with Victoria Hanna, and she took like 6 sentences of Abulafia and turned it into a chant. Rather than being 18 pages or 20 pages of Abulafia, here is a few that can get you somewhere, that we can learn from. And that's what we didn't do. And in many ways, that is what we have to do. Okay. And in terms of the other religion, I mean, it's a wisdom. We read, certainly in academia, you read Christian theology, we read Christian books, we do it all the time. There's no reason not to treat the Indian and other Asian classics the same way as wisdom that we can learn from and enrich ourselves. No one's telling you to go put a shrine in your house and have a daily worship to your own personal Ishvara, to your own personal deity. No, but in terms of wisdom, there's a great material, and that's where we should go forward.
Thank you. Bluth, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add a little point, because you asked about the Avodah Zarah piece. Rav Daniel Sperber and Rav Hefter from Beit Midrash Har El, where I was studying, they both quite sort of actively they've spent a lot of time sort of assuring or exploring Hinduism as, is it Avodah Zarah, is it monotheism, and so on, and they kind of have given the conclusion that it's not, which allowed me to sort of more comfortably dive into the world in India. But even the rabbinate of Israel does not categorize Hinduism as Avodah Zarah. Sure. And Alan, I'll let you jump in on there, because you might know more on that. But I had this thought the other day that theologically, both traditions, I would say Hinduism and Judaism, understand that there is a supreme infinite one. And what Judaism says is that cannot be put into form. It's infinite. How could you put it into form? And I think what Hinduism, in a way, does, and pardon if I'm like misspeaking, but I would say they say there's Brahman, there's an infinite one. And how do we express that? Through infinite forms. And that's where you have all these different deities. And so I would say there's a theological similarity. It manifests quite differently. And someone asked, and I was just typing to you, in the questions about cautioning with appropriation and cherry picking. And I think that's an amazing question. And what does it mean when we have universal truths and different pathways to get there, and pathways that are offered? A lot of like the yogic tradition has been specifically offered as a universal path to anyone of different traditions, right? It's a practice in a way. So these are great. I just want to sort of honor that question and not get into it too much, but honor that question in here.
Thank you. Yeah, Ellen, you want to jump in?
So just quick for those who need the reassurance, the chief rabbinate back in 2007 declared Hinduism as not many gods, that it worships one supreme being. Daniel Sperber has a book coming out. I put out a book, Alon Goshen. All of us who've looked in it have come to the same conclusion that it's another theistic, monistic faith, and they're not worshiping many gods. Beyond that, just to put that out, that then there'll be all sorts of new stuff that's going to be coming out saying that clearly.
So I just, I've observed also in like my own experience in the Ramdas satsang, a lot of Jewish people really kind of are devout Hindus. So Parvati, this question's for you, is why do you think Maharaji, and this is again Ramdas's guru, why do you think so many Jewish people were drawn to that guru? And Alan, you had mentioned also Be Here Now, feeling like a Jewish text. So if you guys want to kind of split that question.
Well, I won't touch the Be Here Now one. Okay. I'll do the Maharaji one. Since I actually worked on Be Here Now. So I'm like, anyway, the thing with Maharaji was when Ramdas came back from India from the first time, when he met Maharaji. And Ramdas was somebody we related to so easily. I mean, he was a very highly intellectual Jew, an ex-Harvard professor. I mean, he was funny. He was, easy to relate to. And, he told of his own foibles. So he wasn't above anybody else, right? So whatever he had gotten, and he was radiant. And what he was talking about was so important to all of us that we had to go see what this was. And so when we met Maharaji and spent time with him, I was in India for a year, the majority of that time with Maharaji, is that we were in the presence of somebody who was really embodying unconditional love, which was an experience none of us had ever had. How do you ever have the experience of somebody loving you totally without judgment, and knowing everything about you, which he let us know. He always let us know in very subtle ways that he absolutely knew everything that was going on within us. So, and yet loved us unconditionally. Being with him, anybody in the group, we all felt like we were living in sort of the same soup of love. And this was something we couldn't find anywhere else. It was tremendous grace to find a being who was this type of embodiment. So I've lost the question now. What was the question?
The question was just simply like,
why are we drawn to him?
Why Maharaji? Yeah.
It's interesting. When I did the book Love Everyone, which is all the stories of the Westerners who went to India and spent time with Maharaji, I interviewed over 72 of the Westerners who were with him. There weren't that many. And at least half of them were Jewish, which I thought was remarkable. I didn't realize this until this panel was coming up, and I went back and I looked at the list. I went, oh my God, almost half of the people were Jewish. And I think it's because we literally could not find anything in Judaism in the West, in America, as we were growing up, that called to that mystic yearning for oneness. And here we had it.
Yeah, having spoken to my parents too, it just seems like Judaism, especially in the 50s and 60s on Long Island or wherever, it was just like a very, unless you were really more Jewishly learned, what you guys were getting seemed very dry and not inspiring.
Right.
And again, like stories that my dad has told me is like, he didn't even want to be Jewish. It wasn't cool to be Jewish. He felt like the outcast, especially growing up. He was born in 1941 during, as a little kid, in the middle of the Holocaust. He said, like, here across the sea, people are killing me, or killing, people for being what I am. Why would I want to be Jewish? And so I think there's a lot of internalized anti-Semitism there too.
Well, we certainly knew we were Jewish, and there are certainly people that since Maharaji left his body and we no longer can see him on this plane anyway, have gone into being somewhat Jewish. But Maharaji is still, the experience that personal experience of being in the presence of that type of unconditional love is sort of the core experience of our lives. And it's been 50 years and we all still feel that way.
Yeah.
So there was something very powerful there.
Yes. Yeah. And they say that now that Maharaji left his body, that people can feel him even more.
Well,
So-
the Whispers in the Heart book is all the stories I'm collecting of people who have met Maharaji since he left his body. And and I've got over 150 of those stories at this point. So yes, he's very busy.
So Alan, I know you want to jump in and just say quickly, how is Be Here Now a Jewish book? And then I want to make sure that Igal and Rodger both have time to do their piece.
The Jewish book is he answered the Jewish questions of the era. I mean, he really took some of his own doctoral research on Jews being too career-oriented in achievement, and then turned it into the karma yoga of Bhagavad Gita. He took the questions Jews needed. Don't be career-oriented. Open up your heart. Show love. Learn to have more faith in religion. And it was geared in many ways, I can see, to a Jewish audience. It was not a generic book. It was the real questions Jews were asking. And at the same time, he took out all questions, all issues of Vaishnava worship or maintaining a home fire. All that was really taken out from his presentation of Hinduism, creating this incredible Jewish book.
Thank you. So Rodger, how did psychedelics lead to the study of mysticism? And you mentioned going from a Tibetan Jewish dialogue to dream work. What's the connection there, and how is this all related to psychedelics?
I just want to jump in on one point. Reb Zalman, during the trip to Dharamsala, mentioned a teaching that came through Shlomo Carlebach, which came from the Mea Shalach, and essentially that it was based on, why aren't Kohens allowed to go to the cemetery? And the answer is because Kohens are supposed to be the teachers of young children, and when you see death, you can't help but be angry at God. And so the whole generation of the 50s and 60s coming after the Holocaust couldn't help but be angry at God. So Jews, in this explanation, went looking to the East for people who weren't angry at God. So accept that or not, I think it's important to contextualize the whole history of American Judaism and Jewry, and not maybe be a little more gentle with how we view even our own backgrounds, because it was partly an historical impact. So my brief, in the brief time I have, is really almost impossible, but basically, I feel like what I experienced in Dharamsala that I wrote about, I saw something and I thought if I captured it, it would affect others, and I think it did. And what I saw really came to me in images. And one of the images was really His Holiness and Reb Zalman talking about angels. And there was a moment where Reb Zalman said, there's an angel of the Jews talking through me and an angel of Tibet listening through you, and vice versa. If we do the dialogue right, that's what's happening. And as they say about Joseph, as he spoke, as he said, so it was. And it was for me. And that's an indescribable moment. And I would say it was a moment, speaking as a poet, and I think the poetic, we need more of the poetic, that our language needs to be more refined when we talk about these beautiful things. It wasn't a metaphor. Other people said, oh, that's just a metaphor. Angels, they're just a metaphor. But they're not. They're a metonymy. There are certain moments of encounter that are so deep and so real and so resonant. And when we absorb what's going on with them with great depth of feeling in our bodies, in our hearts, our minds, and our souls, then those moments are metonymic. That is, as my teacher Colette, who I eventually went to in Jerusalem, said, metonymy is when the unique becomes the one. When a single moment also somehow connects you to the whole. And I think that is available to all of us. And in fact, one sense in which that's available is if we learn how to contemplate our experience deepen our sensuality and connection with images. And then we can find sacred encounters, not just with the substance, but also on our own, in our connections to others and our connections to nature. And what Wordsworth calls spots of time, where there's certain moments that are so resonant and so full of feeling, they affect us very, very deeply. So my journey, briefly, was basically having seen this amazing florid display in India, so much visual, information coming at you, and this 1,000 gods that were everywhere, and it was so beautiful and so intense and so colorful. And the same with the Tibetans, obviously. And they were meditating, and I remember we were sitting there looking at this Tonka painting, and I asked the guy who was next to me, was Richard Gere, and I said, well, what's that water there that this wedding cake of Buddhas is sitting next to? And he said, that's not water, that's a pool of nectar. And so this sense of how we can deepen the feeling of imagery. And I do think one appeal of Hinduism to Jews is this sense of colorfulness and imagery and of darshan, of devotion through eyes, that we can get to, but in a different way. And I asked Reb Zalman who could teach me Jewish visualization, and he sent me to Colette Abouker Muscat, and I write about her in the History of Last Night's Dream. My encounter with her was really amazing. And she taught me a method of listening, verbal imagery. That's the Jewish path in many ways, not the only one. We also have some visuals, but the sense of taking text and bringing it to life by bringing back the imagination. So often we read texts at such a dry way. We're not really feeling the words. We need to feel more deeply. Reb Zalman used to say, you can be a Gemara Jew, you can be a Mishnah Jew, but he said you could also be a Psalm Jew. You could have a complete spiritual life by reading the Psalms. And I think that's really important to understand, that there are many different ways we could access depth in our experience. Colette's visualizations led me to dreams. I tell the story in the History of Last Night's Dream. I don't think it's really time to tell it here, except to say that in dreams, in my experience, I've been working with him for almost 20 years, we enter into the very same space that the Kabbalah describes. It's a 5-dimensional space of imbricated space, time, and feeling, which the Kabbalists speak of as Oshan, right? Of Olam, Shana, and Neshama. And so what's fascinating about the dream experience, and I believe it's similar in a psychedelic experience at times, the closer you get to someone, the more deeply you feel the encounter. The further away, the less you feel it. The more time you give to it, it deepens. And the whole sense of time is not simply being this linear Newtonian ongoing thing, which it really isn't, right? It's not just space-time, but it's space-time feeling in an interactive way. And I think dreams are great training for learning how to be in that space-time feeling, 5-dimensional experience. And I really think that, I would also just say that the changes biochemically that we experience every night when we dream are really profound chemical, biochemical, and neurological changes. Whole different parts of the brain are suppressed, different chemicals come in. So I just would really recommend the sense of paying more attention to dreams. It was something Reb Zalman did. And I think it could actually be very helpful in navigating what I think is the same 5-dimensional space that people also experience at times with psychedelics. So I'll just stop there because really, it's too much for me to say. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. And then, so I want to make sure we also touch on the Israeli aspect of this conversation. So, Igal, can you talk about the India trip as one of the most significant to Israel's trance and psychedelic scenes? And, of the Israeli experience in India, what is this dialectic between the post-army trauma, with both wanting to escape and also this sense of seeking? And you had mentioned in the introduction as well, how people who are having psychedelic experiences in India inadvertently are being led back to their Judaism. And of course, there are plenty of opportunities in India too to engage with Judaism if you go to a Chabad or a Beit Yehudit or whatever. So take it away.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, a lot of people go to India to break free, and part of what people are trying to break free from is their post-army trauma, major, minor, and basically most people don't go with the intention of facing their trauma, as many people don't go to encounter psychedelics as a means to encounter the trauma, but a lot of time this is what happens. And based on this is also what we meet. I am co-founder of a psychedelic harm reduction, like a safe space in parties and festivals. So it's kind of the same phenomenon we experience in trans parties in India or in Israel, and generally the Israeli trip in India. And this is also where a lot of people start to heal, because they go to run away, but then they meet it head on, their own trauma and spirituality. And if they're met by kind of a proper container of setting and people around them, this is where they start to heal. And I think this kind of we don't talk much. I think in Israel in general, we don't talk much about the post-Holocaust trauma, except for Holocaust Memorial Day, basically. I think that kind of our army traumas are kind of a reincarnation of our post-Holocaust trauma, and I think that where many people reconnect to Judaism in India, even if they're secular and they didn't go to meet their spiritual side or wanted to run away from Israel or Judaism, is partly because we meet spirituality in India. And as many of the participants said, spirituality is spirituality, and you meet it from one end and then you kind of find it in your own sources. And also, I think we tend to have very long journeys to India, like 6 months, 1 year. So people go back and forth for years, and you find yourself missing home, even if you ran away from home. And this is where many people kind of reconnect, and they start connecting the dots between Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism and their own spiritual experiences. And I think that, like, in my clinic, I work often with integration, and for years I worked with people's integration back from India or South America, mostly from India, because people have such profound experiences. And it's a lot like psychedelic integration, because basically they're all places to kind of draw inspiration, insight, wisdom into our own daily lives. So there's, for me, kind of psychedelics, India, Israel, Judaism, the trans festival scene. It's all kind of, it's very, very interconnected from our experience here. And also India being what it is, it's kind of, it feels like the root of this this subculture in Israel of psychedelic spiritualism. It's kind of where a lot of it feeds from.
Thank you. So we have just 5 minutes left. By the way, I just want to say, like, having experienced, you know, the being in Goa myself not too long ago, it sort of seems, you said something which I think was so pertinent, and someone put in the chat, army trauma is a reincarnation of Holocaust trauma. You know, I think, like, there's so much of the Jewish experience that has to do with, like, getting out of ourselves almost, and, like, needing these release. And, like, I think the relationship that Jews have to psytrance specifically in Goa, and then bringing that back to the Israeli scene, it seems like the Israeli psytrance party scene is almost just an integration of the whole India experience. And it feels like there's so much of, like, a similar essence in both of those aspects. So we have time for, I think, just one question here. There was one person who had a very great, succinct question that I want to try to find. How do you think the spiritual relationship between Judaism and India is? For example, evidence of cultural exchange through trade, etc. So anyone here want to answer the question? How long have Jews and Indian people been kind of compadres? Maybe Alan, yeah.
So we've been related since the time of King Solomon. There are Tamil words in the Bible. Now people find all sorts of connections of Tamil influence on Sefer Yetzirah, probably coming from some sort of Central Asian point of view. And like I said, you can then know that most of the classic Hindu works, the Yoga Sutra, Bhagavad Gita, were available in Judeo-Arabic and vice versa. Extensive relationship, and Jews lived for 3,000 years in India with basically no anti-Semitism, and that's an important point.
I'd like to just add that when you're there and you drive in the countryside and you see someone farming with a horse and a plow and carrying sheaves, or when you go to a little shtibel temple that's devoted to the cobra. I went to see the cobra, but the temple's there to keep the cobra away. Anyway, I went down there and the people are bringing their lambs, as sacrifices. You really get a take on our own Jewish history and maybe the sense of how religions evolved from the land and from the soil. And so it's not just, it's scholarly, that's really important, but it's also visceral, immediate. Wow, I'm back thousands of years ago when you go into rural India. And I think I don't know, I found that very moving.
Any last words that anyone wants to add before we're out of time in 2 minutes?
Just very quickly, this to me feels like truly the beginning or middle, but definitely not the end of something. So if folks want to continue this conversation in some way, shape, or form, some point, maybe I'll just start by collecting a list. Just email me, say you're interested, and at some point we'll regather and continue, because I know that there's like a lot. And just to echo Madison's invitation at the beginning, India is, so many people in India are struggling so deeply right now. So let's use this opportunity to jump off and share generously our resources. GiveIndia.org is an easy place to start. And yeah, that's all. So thanks again.
Well, thank you. And thank you. Yeah, Alan, you want one more
One
thing?
final thing is so people don't have to go not knowing what's out there. It'd be nice if there'd be some psychedelic Jewish Beit Midrash going forward, in which people can now have a place to turn to when they're actually looking for people to have resonance with these ideas.
Thank you. It's a really good idea. Well, we hope that this conference is really the start of building more communities. So, the psychedelic Beit Midrash, I think, is something that is definitely going to hopefully happen in the future. So yeah, anyways, everyone, thank you again so much for doing this panel, and I'm reading the chat as we're doing this, and the questions in here are just so amazing. So like Bluth said, please email her. And yeah, enjoy the next panel. It's on Jewish trauma, which is another interesting point, I think, to finish on after this. So thank you.